the Saudi Arabian Armed Forces, the Royal Saudi Navy, the Royal Saudi Air Force, the Royal Saudi Air Defense, and the Royal Saudi Strategic Missile Force. The King of Saudi Arabia is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and forms military policy. With the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior, the 5 armed forces are among 8 military forces of Saudi Arabia, with the others including the Saudi Arabian National Guard, the Saudi Royal Guard Regiment and Saudi Arabian Border Guards. In addition, there is also the General Intelligence Presidency, which is the main intelligence service. The armed forces are one of the best funded in the world. Saudi Arabia has the world's 9th largest defense budget. International Institute for Strategic Studies estimates in 2017 listed a total of 127,000 personnel. The RSLF figure is quite possibly inflated. The National Guard, with 100,000 personnel, many tribal and only available on call-up, and 24,500 paramilitary personnel round out the figures. The IISS military balance lists reserve personnel when reliable figures are available, but did not list any reserve personnel for Saudi Arabia. The first steps towards building an institutionalized armed force for Saudi Arabia began in the 1940s, when Saudi regulars numbered perhaps 1,000 to 1,500. Gaub saying that officers mostly came from the Ottoman troops who had served the Sharif of Makkah. Before his being expelled in 1924, a Ministry of Defense was created in 1944, a military school founded in Taif, and the United Kingdom began efforts to try to build a professional force. After the failure of this UK program, a subsequent US program which ran from 1951 also failed to reach its objective, and geopolitical concerns, namely the Free Officers' Revolution in Egypt followed by a brutal Ba'athist coup in Iraq, wherein expanded post-colonial Arab armies overthrew the domestic monarchies they had sworn allegiance to in 1952 and 1958 respectively. These events led the Saudis to the rational conclusion their own military could potentially pose a greater threat to their line than any of their neighbors. In the decades that followed, though the kingdom experienced unprecedented economic expansion and modernization, the Royal Armed Forces remained contained. From the late 1950s to the late 1970s, the Saudis did expand and modernize their military but at a stagnant rate. This despite the fact the region was regularly at war. In 1969, South Yemeni forces attacked the kingdom along the border but were swiftly defeated by Royal and Allied forces. When the Yom Kippur War broke out in 1973, Saudi Arabia used oil as a weapon to aid the Arab cause. This strategy significantly influenced world opinion against Israel, though to what extent remains unclear. Following these successes, the Saudis would pursue only limited increased support for their armed forces in the wake of the Grand Mosque seizure in 1979. In the 1980s, Saudi Arabia became a major source of financial but not military assistance for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and the regime of Saddam Hussein in its war against revolutionary Iran. The 1991 Gulf War saw the greatest threat to the kingdom in modern history and the largest deployment of Saudi armed forces in history, with all levels of the Saudi military actively participating as part of the UN coalition against Iraq. In 1987, members of the Air Force, Army, and Navy used to be mainly recruits from groups of people without a strong identity from the Najd tribal system and people from urban areas. King Abdullah increasingly moved towards comprehensive military reform following what he considered a failed response by Saudi forces to Houthi incursions in 2009. In the early 2010s, after almost 20 years of relatively modest increases in military spending, the Saudi government embarked an unprecedented expansion of the kingdom's armed forces. This shift in policy was spearheaded primarily by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who took over as defense minister in 2015. It is believed the continued high-level expansion of the Saudi armed forces was a response to not only short-term threats but long-term regional strategic concerns, namely the increasing strength of Iran and the uncertain future of America's role in the region. In 2019, The government of Saudi Arabia stated that women can start working in the military. In the past they could only work in police. The armed forces are mainly the responsibility of the Ministry of Defense and Aviation, which also oversees the construction of civilian airports as well as military bases and meteorology departments. Crown Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz was Saudi Arabia's Minister of Defense and Aviation from 1962 to 2011. The Vice Minister, Abdulrahman bin Abdulaziz, was his full brother and served until November 2011. His oldest son, Khalid bin Sultan, was appointed Assistant Minister in 2001 and was in office until April 2013. Spending on defense and security has increased.